A single leaf drifted down through the twilight of an ancient forest. It turned slowly in the air, catching a pale silver light that seemed older than the moon itself, before settling among roots thicker than the walls of kingdoms. Around it stood trees so vast that their highest branches vanished into darkness. No birds sang. No axe rang against wood. The silence felt alive, as though the forest itself were listening. Somewhere beyond sight, something stirred, not with the haste of mortal creatures, but with the patience of centuries. Tonight's journey, though not a journey of haste or danger, is the complete history of the Ents, the tree shepherds of Middle-earth, those ancient guardians whose memories stretched back toward the dawn of the world. As you settle into the quiet rhythm of the tale, perhaps note which night of listening this is for you. And if you have only just arrived, let this be night 1. We begin not with Treebeard himself, nor with Fangorn Forest, but with a question that reaches back before the rising of the sun and moon, before the kingdoms of elves and men, and even before the awakening of the dwarves. Why did Yavanna fear a people who did not yet exist? The question first appears in one of the oldest stories preserved in the Silmarillion, in the chapter called Of Aule and Yavanna. At that time the world was still young. The 2 lamps had long been destroyed by Melkor. The Valar dwelt in Aman beyond the sea, and the 2 trees, Telperion and Lorelin, cast their alternating silver and golden radiance across the Blessed Realm. Among the Valar was Aule, master of crafts and substances, the great smith whose delight was the making of things. Mountains, gems, metals, and the very bones of the earth fell within his knowledge. Yet Aule grew impatient for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, the elves and men who had been promised but had not yet awakened. In that impatience, he committed one of the most extraordinary acts in the history of Arda. Secretly, beneath the mountains of Middle-earth, Aule fashioned 7 fathers of the dwarves. He shaped them from the substance of the earth itself. He taught them language. He instructed them in craft. Yet they couldn't truly live, because life belonged to Eru Ilúvatar alone. When Ilúvatar confronted Aule, the smith immediately repented. He lifted his hammer to destroy his own creation, rather than rebel against his maker. At that moment, Ilúvatar accepted his humility and granted life to the dwarves, though their awakening would be delayed until after the coming of the elves. The tale might seem to belong entirely to the dwarves, but Yavanna heard what had happened, and her thoughts turned elsewhere. Yavanna Kementari, Queen of the Earth, was the giver of fruits and growing things. The forests of Arda lay under her care. Every seed, every root, every towering tree belonged in some sense to her guardianship. When she learned that the dwarves would someday awaken, she did not first wonder about their songs or their kingdoms. She thought of their axes. Aule spoke proudly of the skill his children would possess. They would mine deep beneath mountains. They would cut stone. They would build halls unlike any that had existed before. Yet Yavanna answered with a concern that reaches across the entire history of Middle-earth. She reminded Aule that his children would have little love for living things. Trees would be felled. Forests would shrink. The growing things of the earth would suffer under the needs of craftsmen and builders. Aule did not deny it. Indeed, he answered that the children of Ilúvatar themselves would do much the same. There is something striking in this exchange. The threat to the forests does not come from evil. Melkor already existed. His destruction was obvious. Yavanna feared something subtler. She feared ordinary use. She feared the appetite of good people pursuing worthy goals. A house requires timber. A ship requires planks. A city requires beams and fuel. The danger was not malice. It was success. The world that Ilúvatar intended would inevitably consume parts of itself in order to flourish. Why did Manwe respond to Yavanna in such a mysterious way? Troubled by her thoughts, Yavanna went to Manwe Sulimo, king of the Valar, who dwelt upon Tanikatil, the highest mountain in Aman. There she spoke of the growing things entrusted to her care. The conversation that followed feels almost prophetic. Manwe listened in silence, and then his mind seemed to travel beyond the circles of the world. Tolkien describes him looking far away, as if hearing echoes of the music of the Ainur itself. In that moment, Manwe perceived something hidden within the design of Eru Ilúvatar. He told Yavanna that her concerns had already been anticipated. The music sung before the creation of the world contained themes beyond the knowledge of any individual Vala. Nothing that had arisen in her heart had escaped Ilúvatar's foresight. Then came the promise that would eventually give birth to the Ents. Manwe declared that when the children of Ilúvatar awoke, spirits would also awaken among living things. The forests would not remain defenseless forever. Yavanna immediately understood the significance of what she had heard. The trees themselves would receive guardians. Shepherds would arise to protect them. The phrase appears only briefly in the text, but its consequences echo through thousands of years of history. The forests would have voices. The woods would remember injuries. Axes would no longer strike entirely mute victims. Somewhere in the future, among the deep places of Middle-earth, watchers would stand beside the trees. The promise extends beyond the Ents alone. In the same passage, Manwe speaks of the eagles, who would dwell among the mountains and watch from the heights. The natural world of Tolkien is never merely scenery. Rivers possess character. Mountains can inspire dread. Forests develop personalities that feel almost conscious. The Ents become the clearest expression of this idea, but the roots of the concept reach all the way back to this conversation in Aman, beneath the light of the two trees. Why were the future tree shepherds hidden so deeply in the design of the world? The answer seems connected to one of Tolkien's oldest themes. Again and again, power arises where it is least expected. Hobbits change the fate of the ring. A gardener helps save Middle-earth. Mercy defeats strength where armies fail. In much the same way, the defense of the forests was not entrusted to mighty warriors or kings. Instead, it was entrusted to creatures who would spend most of their lives listening to leaves and watching seasons pass. At the time of Yavanna's conversation with Manwe, none of this had yet appeared in visible form. The elves still slept beside Cuiviénen in the future. The dwarves waited in secret chambers. Men had not awakened. Beleriand had not risen into glory. Gondolin, Doriath, Nargothrond, and Númenor existed only as distant possibilities within the unfolding history of Arda. Yet already the seed had been planted. The tree shepherds had been promised. Their story had begun before they themselves existed. The light of Telperion shimmered across the slopes of Valinor, while Laurelin's gold faded toward evening. Yavanna departed with her fears eased, but not entirely removed. She knew forests would still suffer. She knew axes would still bite into bark. The promise was not that trees would never be harmed. The promise was that they would not stand alone. Somewhere beyond the horizon of ages, among lands not yet mapped, and beneath stars not yet risen, the guardians of the forests waited for their hour to awaken. What were the Ents before they learned to speak? The question hangs over the earliest history of the tree shepherds, because Tolkien never records a moment when the first Ent opened his eyes or took his first step. Unlike the awakening of the elves at Cuiviénen or the coming of men in Hildorian, no chapter of the published legendarium describes the birth of the Ents directly. What we possess instead are scattered clues, and the most important of them comes from Treebeard himself in The Lord of the Rings. Speaking to Merry and Pippin in Fangorn Forest during the year Third Age 3019, Treebeard explains that the elves found the Ents and taught them language long ago. The statement is brief, but it reveals something extraordinary. The Ents already existed before they learned speech from the firstborn children of Iluvatar. The chronology places their origins deep in the Elder Days. The elves awoke beside the waters of Cuivienen during the years of the trees, before the creation of the sun and moon. Soon afterward, the Valar summoned them westward toward Aman in what became known as the Great Journey. During those ancient migrations, the elves encountered many peoples and creatures who would later become woven into the history of Middle-earth. Somewhere in that vast and largely unrecorded span of years, they found the beings whom Yavanna's promise had brought forth. The elves gave them names. More importantly, they gave them words. Treebeard speaks of this memory with unmistakable affection. The elves, he says, cured the Ents of their silence. Before that meeting, the tree shepherds possessed thought and awareness, but not the elaborate language through which memory could be preserved and shared. The implication is profound. Imagine ages passing while possessing intelligence, but no developed speech. Imagine watching forests grow, rivers shift their courses, and stars wheel overhead, yet lacking names for what you observed. The coming of the elves transformed the Ents from guardians of the woods into a people with history. Why did the elves teach language to creatures so different from themselves? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the elves. Throughout Tolkien's writings, the Eldar display a remarkable hunger for naming and understanding the world around them. They named mountains, rivers, stars, trees, and winds. Language itself became one of their greatest arts. The Vanyar, Noldor, and Teleri developed distinct tongues and traditions. To encounter beings as ancient and strange as the Ents would have fascinated them. Rather than treating the tree shepherds as beasts, they recognized minds worthy of conversation. Treebeard's own speech preserves traces of that ancient relationship. He delights in names. He stretches them out. He savors them. When he introduces himself as Fangorn, he immediately begins explaining names in different languages. He remembers words from ages long vanished. His language feels almost elvish in its reverence for memory, though it remains distinctly Entish. This connection between the Eldar and the Ents would endure long after kingdoms rose and fell. By the end of the Third Age, many ancient friendships had vanished, but Treebeard still spoke warmly of the elves. The Entish language itself became famous for its extraordinary length and complexity. Treebeard explains that real names in Entish often describe the complete history and nature of a thing. A short name could never be entirely accurate, because no living creature or place could be understood in isolation from its story. This idea reflects a deep current running through Tolkien's world. Things possess meaning because of their histories. A sword matters because of who forged it and who carried it. A forest matters because of what it has witnessed. The Ents carried this principle farther than any other people. Long before the founding of Gondolin, before Thingol established his realm in Doriath, before the Noldor returned from Aman after the rebellion of Feanor, the Ents were already learning the names of hills and streams. They wandered immense forests that have long since disappeared. During the Elder Days, vast woodlands covered regions later transformed by war and cataclysm. The geography familiar from The Lord of the Rings did not yet exist. Entire mountain ranges stood where seas would later roll. Rivers flowed along courses now lost beneath ocean waters. What did the Ents actually do during the First Age? The surprising answer is that the published texts say very little. While heroes such as Beren, Luthien, Turin Turambar and Arundel dominate the surviving narratives. The Ents remain largely absent from the great wars against Morgoth. Yet absence does not mean non-existence. Treebeard himself provides a crucial clue when he recalls walking in lands west of the Misty Mountains before enormous changes reshaped the world. He remembers places that no longer exist in the Third Age. This memory almost certainly reaches back toward Beleriand. Beleriand was the great western land of the First Age, lying between the Blue Mountains and the sea. There stood the forests of Neldareth and Regen, where Luthien danced beneath starlight before her meeting with Beren. There stretched the guarded realm of Doriath under King Thingol and Queen Melian. There rose the hidden city of Gondolin among the encircling mountains. The wars against Morgoth ravaged much of this land over nearly 6 centuries. By the end of the First Age, following the War of Wrath, most of Beleriand sank beneath the sea. Treebeard never explicitly says, "I walked in Doriath," nor does Tolkien provide such a statement elsewhere. Yet Treebeard's memories reach back far enough that he recalls a world older than the maps known to Frodo and his companions. When he speaks of lands now lost, the listener senses a living witness to events that survive elsewhere only in legend. Elrond knew ancient histories through memory and tradition. Galadriel had personally lived through much of the First and Second Ages. But Treebeard possessed a different perspective. He remembered landscapes themselves. Why do the Ents remain on the edges of so many great stories? One answer emerges from their nature. The Ents are not seekers of power. They build no empires. They mint no coins. They establish no dynasties. The histories preserved by elves and men naturally focus upon kings, wars, migrations, and realms. The Ents cared about different matters. They measured time in the growth of forests rather than the reigns of rulers. A century might feel brief. A millennium might pass without requiring urgent action. Their priorities placed them outside the concerns that generated most written chronicles. Yet the First Age certainly affected them. Morgoth's wars devastated enormous regions of Middle-earth. Forests burned, rivers were poisoned, entire landscapes were transformed. The Battle of Sudden Flame, Dagor Bragolach, shattered long-standing defenses across Beleriand. Later came the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, one of the greatest disasters in Elvish history. It is difficult to imagine the Ents remaining untouched by such upheavals. Even if they avoided the battlefields themselves, the destruction of forests would have struck directly at the purpose for which they existed. As the centuries of the First Age drew toward their end, Morgoth's power finally collapsed beneath the assault of the Valar. The War of Wrath lasted for years and reshaped the physical structure of the world. Mountains were broken. Regions vanished. Coastlines changed forever. When the conflict ended around First Age 587, Beleriand largely disappeared beneath the sea. Countless creatures perished. Entire cultures vanished. Through all this, somewhere beyond the surviving records, the tree shepherds endured. And so the First Age closes with an image both quiet and immense. The great heroes of the Elder Days pass into song. The Silmarils are lost from the world. Morgoth is thrust through the door of night. Beneath unfamiliar stars, forests continue to grow in Middle-earth. Among them move the Ents, older now, wiser perhaps, carrying memories that no written chronicle records. Their true story is only beginning, for a different challenge waits ahead, not a dark lord seeking conquest, but a sorrow that will wound the Ents more deeply than any war. Soon they will meet the Entwives, and in that meeting, the future of their entire people will be decided. Why did the Ents and Entwives, who seemed made for one another, eventually choose different worlds? Few mysteries in Tolkien's legendarium carry the same quiet sadness. The fall of Gondolin came through betrayal. The destruction of Númenor came through pride. The tragedy of the Ents emerged from something far more familiar. It began with differing desires. When Treebeard speaks of the Entwives in The Lord of the Rings, his voice changes. The slow confidence remains, but beneath it lies a grief that has endured for thousands of years. By the time Merry and Pippin meet him in Fangorn Forest during Third Age 3019, the separation has become so ancient that entire civilizations have risen and vanished during the interval. Treebeard explains that the Ents loved the great wild woods. They delighted in untamed forests, where trees grew according to their own nature. Deep valleys, mountain slopes, hidden glades, and ancient forests held their affection. The Entwives looked upon the same world differently. They loved order. They enjoyed planting, arranging, tending, and shaping growth into beautiful forms. Where the Ents admired wilderness, the Entwives admired cultivation. Neither vision was wrong, yet over centuries the difference widened. The contrast reveals something important about the nature of the Ents themselves. They were never merely walking trees. They possessed individual personalities, preferences, and philosophies. Tolkien avoids presenting them as a single-minded race. The Entwives appreciated gardens, fields, orchards, herbs, and fruit-bearing plants. They wished to teach living things where and how to grow. Their interests brought them closer to the practical concerns of elves and men. The Ents remained devoted to forests whose oldest trees stood beyond the influence of any gardener. Why did the Entwives leave the forests behind? According to Treebeard's account, the Entwives eventually crossed eastward. Their settlements developed in the lands beyond the great river Anduin. The geography matters here. Fangorn Forest lay west of Anduin, beneath the southern reaches of the Misty Mountains. The Entwives established themselves farther east, in regions that would later become known as the Brown Lands. These territories occupied fertile ground between the river Anduin and the lands stretching toward Mordor and Rhûn. Long before those names carried dark associations, the area flourished. The Entwives became teachers. Men learned much from them. Treebeard specifically recalls that the Entwives instructed human communities in agriculture. They taught planting, sowing, ordering fields, and cultivating crops. This detail often surprises readers because it places the Entwives among the quiet builders of civilization. While kings and warriors dominate most historical narratives, the Entwives contributed to something equally important. They helped transform scattered settlements into productive societies capable of supporting larger populations. The image is striking. Somewhere during the Second Age, while Gil-galad ruled the High Elves in Lindon and Númenor rose to greatness in the sea, the Entwives tended orchards and fields in eastern Middle-earth. Fruit trees grew in ordered rows. Grain ripened beneath the sun. Gardens spread across landscapes that had once been wild. Men benefited from their wisdom, though later generations would largely forget the source of their knowledge. The Entwives became invisible architects of prosperity. Treebeard remembers this period with both admiration and regret. He never mocks the Entwives' preferences. He never claims they were mistaken. In fact, his account suggests respect for what they achieved. The tragedy lies not in their choices themselves, but in the increasing distance between their lives and those of the Ents. Visits became less frequent. Shared interests diminished. The forests and gardens drifted apart, and so did their guardians. Why did neither side compromise? The question becomes more poignant the longer one considers it. The Ents and Entwives loved many of the same things. Both cared for growing life. Both cherished the natural world. Yet they valued different expressions of it. Tolkien understood that some divisions arise not from hostility, but from incompatible priorities. The Ents sought preservation. The Entwives sought improvement. One side treasured what already existed. The other saw potential for what could be created. This distinction echoes throughout Tolkien's wider mythology. Consider the difference between the elves and men. Both are children of Ilúvatar, yet they experience time differently and pursue different destinies. Consider also the contrast between Feanor and Galadriel. Both possessed immense gifts, yet their ambitions took radically different forms. The separation of the Ents and Entwives belongs to this same pattern. Shared origins do not guarantee shared paths. The sadness deepens because neither side foresaw catastrophe. Their separation was not final at first. The Ents expected to visit. The Entwives expected the same. The forests remained. The gardens flourished. There was no obvious reason to believe that one day the distance would become permanent. Looking backward through history, the disaster appears inevitable. Living within it, the participants likely saw only temporary arrangements. Why did the Entwives choose the lands that would later become the Brown Lands? The answer lies partly in geography. The region east of Anduin contained broad, fertile plains suitable for cultivation. Unlike the dense forests favored by the Ents, these lands offered space for orchards, fields, and organized growth. Rivers provided water. The climate supported agriculture. From the perspective of the Entwives, the choice made perfect sense. They selected exactly the sort of landscape where their talents could flourish. Yet the location carried hidden dangers. The Brown Lands occupied a strategic corridor within Middle-earth. Great powers would eventually pass through or contest the region. During the Second Age, Sauron's influence expanded steadily after the forging of the Rings of Power. Around Second Age 1600, he completed the One Ring in Mordor. By the centuries that followed, conflicts increasingly spread across western Middle-earth. The fertile lands east of Anduin found themselves uncomfortably close to future centers of war. Treebeard's memories preserve a haunting contrast. He remembers the Entwives' gardens as green, ordered, and abundant. By the end of the Third Age, travelers crossing the Brown Lands encounter something entirely different. The region appears desolate. Vegetation grows poorly. The earth seems exhausted. The very name, Brown Lands, speaks of loss. Somewhere between those two realities lies one of the greatest unanswered tragedies in Tolkien's world. What happened when Sauron's wars reached the gardens of the Entwives? The published texts provide a crucial clue. During the Second Age, Sauron waged massive campaigns against elves and men. Following the forging of the One Ring and the revelation of his betrayal, war erupted between Sauron and the elves. Later came the intervention of Númenor, first under Tar-Minastir and eventually under Ar-Pharazôn. Armies crossed great distances. Regions were devastated. The Brown Lands lay directly in the path of forces moving through eastern Middle-earth. Treebeard believes the Entwives were lost during these upheavals. He never presents it as certainty. Rather, it is the conclusion reached after centuries of fruitless searching. The gardens disappeared. The lands were ravaged. The Entwives never returned. In Treebeard's memory, destruction and disappearance became intertwined. The timing aligns closely enough that many readers accept the connection. Yet Tolkien never confirms exactly what occurred. This uncertainty matters. Tolkien had opportunities to state plainly that the Entwives perished, but he never did. Their fate remains unresolved in the published works. The absence of confirmation leaves room for hope, however faint. Treebeard himself continues to hope. Even after thousands of years, he refuses to abandon the possibility that somewhere, beyond the knowledge of elves, men, and wizards, the Entwives survived. As the centuries moved onward and the Second Age advanced toward its final cataclysms, the separation that began as a difference in taste transformed into something far more terrible. The Ents remained among the forests. The Entwives tended lands east of Anduin. Then the shadow of Sauron lengthened across Middle-earth, roads filled with armies, kingdoms prepared for war. And without realizing it, the Ents and Entwives were approaching the last moment when either side would know where the other could be found. Did the Entwives die in Sauron's wars, or did they simply vanish from history? No question troubles Treebeard more deeply. When Merry asks about the Entwives in The Lord of the Rings, the ancient Ent does not answer with certainty. That absence of certainty is itself important. Tolkien could have provided a definitive fate. He could have written that the Entwives were slain when Sauron's armies crossed the Brownlands. He could have described their destruction in the manner of so many other tragedies throughout Middle-earth. Instead, he leaves only fragments, memories, and unanswered hopes. The strongest clue comes from the condition of the Brownlands themselves. During the War of the Ring, the Fellowship travels south along the great river Anduin. Aragorn points out the desolate region stretching eastward from the river. Once fertile and green, it has become barren. The name Brownlands reflects what travelers see before them, a landscape stripped of life and vigor. The devastation is ancient. Long grass does not sway there. Forests do not return. The land bears the marks of violence inflicted centuries before. Treebeard remembers a very different place. In his recollection, the region east of Anduin held the gardens of the Entwives. Fields flourished, fruit trees grew, crops matured under careful guidance. Men learned cultivation from teachers who possessed immense patience and knowledge. The contrast between these two visions could hardly be greater. One landscape nourished life. The other seems exhausted by death. Between them stands the long shadow of Sauron. The chronology aligns with major events of the Second Age. After forging the One Ring around Second Age 1600, Sauron openly challenged the elves. The War of the Elves and Sauron erupted centuries later. His armies spread across vast territories. Eregion, the realm founded by Celebrimbor near the western gates of Khazad-dûm, was destroyed around Second Age 1697. The devastation reached far beyond a single kingdom. Entire regions suffered as armies marched, burned, and conquered. The Brownlands lay directly within a zone vulnerable to such destruction. Why did the Ents fail to find the Entwives afterward? Treebeard's answer is painfully simple. They searched. The Ents crossed great distances. They looked through forests, valleys, plains, and lands abandoned by war. The search continued not for years, but for ages. Long after Numenor rose to its peak of power, they searched. Long after Numenor fell beneath the sea in Second Age, 3319, they searched. Long after the last alliance of elves and men defeated Sauron at the end of the Second Age, they continued searching. This persistence reveals something important about Entish character. Entis are often remembered for slowness, but their loyalty runs equally deep. A human kingdom might abandon a hopeless quest after a generation. The Ents measured time differently. Treebeard himself lived through events separated by thousands of years. To such beings, the search for lost companions remained meaningful long after mortal peoples would have forgotten the names involved. Their patience became both a strength and a source of sorrow. Yet the searches yielded nothing conclusive. No surviving settlements were found. No messages appeared. No confirmed sightings emerged. The silence stretched across centuries. One can feel the weight of that silence when Treebeard speaks. He does not sound angry. He sounds tired. The loss has become part of the landscape of his mind, as permanent as the roots of the trees around him. There is a subtle tragedy here. The Ents were created to guard forests. Their strength lay in endurance. Trees survive storms because they remain rooted. But searching requires movement. It requires leaving familiar places behind. The Ents were never a wandering people by nature. The disappearance of the Entwives forced them into a role they had not been made to fill. They became seekers of something that could not be found. Could the Entwives have survived somewhere beyond the knowledge of Middle-earth? Tolkien himself entertained the possibility. In one of his letters, written long after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, he addressed questions about the Entwives directly. He admitted that he did not know their ultimate fate with certainty. His language is careful. He suggested that their gardens were likely destroyed during Sauron's wars, yet he stopped short of declaring their extinction as a confirmed fact. This distinction matters. Tolkien was willing to close many mysteries. He chose not to close this one. The uncertainty has inspired countless theories among readers. Some imagine the Entwives retreating eastward into lands beyond the maps known to Gondor and Rohan. Others suggest hidden valleys where remnants survived in secrecy. A more melancholy theory proposes that they gradually diminished, becoming increasingly tree-like until they could no longer be distinguished from the forests they once cultivated. None of these ideas appear as canon. They remain speculation. Yet the fact that such speculation remains possible reflects Tolkien's deliberate choice. Treebeard himself never abandons hope. That hope is one of the most moving aspects of his character. By Third Age 3019, he has endured thousands of years without success. Entire civilizations have appeared and vanished during the search. Arnor has risen and fallen. Khazad-dûm has become Moria. The Witch King has come and gone. Still Treebeard listens for news. Still he wonders. Still he remembers. Why did the loss of the Entwives change the Ents themselves? The answer emerges gradually as the ages pass. Without the Entwives, the Ents cease to be a growing people. New generations do not appear. The race begins to diminish, not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow decline. This pattern echoes one of Tolkien's most important themes. The history of Middle-earth is filled with fading peoples. The elves depart westward. The Dúnedain diminish from the glory of Númenor. Ancient kingdoms become ruins. The Ents experience their own version of the long decline. Their loneliness becomes increasingly visible. By the late Third Age, Fangorn Forest contains only a small number of true Ents. They still gather. They still remember old songs. They still perform their duties. Yet they are clearly fewer than before. Treebeard never speaks of thriving communities spread across Middle-earth. Instead, he describes scattered remnants holding on to ancient traditions. The disappearance of the Entwives transformed an enduring people into a dwindling one. At the same time, the forests themselves faced mounting pressures. Human populations expanded. Kingdoms required timber. Ships required timber. Fortifications required timber. Even good rulers depended upon wood for survival. The threat Yavanna foresaw in the years of the trees continued unfolding exactly as she had feared. Axes multiplied, roads expanded, wilderness retreated. The Ents watched century after century of gradual change. Why did Fangorn survive when so many other ancient forests vanished? Part of the answer lies in geography. Fangorn Forest occupied a position beneath the southeastern slopes of the Misty Mountains. To its south stretched the Gap of Rohan. To its east flowed the River Anduin. The terrain provided natural protection. Yet geography alone cannot explain its survival. Other forests enjoyed favorable locations and still disappeared. Fangorn endured because something lived there that most intruders preferred not to confront. Stories spread among men. travelers vanished. Strange sounds echoed beneath the trees. Woodcutters entered and failed to return. The Rohirrim respected the forest, but rarely ventured deeply within it. Even orcs displayed caution when approaching its heart. The reputation of Fangorn became a shield. Fear accomplished what walls never could. The presence of the Ents preserved the forest more effectively than any kingdom's laws. By the middle years of the Third Age, Fangorn stood as one of the last great remnants of a much older world. Elsewhere, forests had been cut back, burned, or transformed. Yet beneath its vast canopy, ancient memories still survived. Treebeard walked there. Other Ents wandered there. The search for the Entwives had not ended, but it had become quieter. Less hopeful, perhaps, though never entirely abandoned. And as the centuries continued their slow march forward, another mystery began to emerge from the shadows of Fangorn itself. The Ents were not the only strange beings moving beneath those ancient branches. What exactly were the Hurns, and why did even Treebeard speak of them with caution? Among all the mysteries surrounding the Ents, few are stranger. Readers often remember Treebeard, Quickbeam, and the Entmoot. Yet lurking beneath the branches of Fangorn is another presence that Tolkien deliberately leaves indistinct. The Huorns appear in The Lord of the Rings as beings connected to the Ents, but not identical to them. They move when they choose. They seem capable of thought. They obey, or at least cooperate with, the Ents. Yet they remain silent, shadowy, and difficult to classify. Tolkien never provides a complete explanation. Treebeard himself offers the first clues. Speaking to Merry and Pippin, he explains that some trees have become increasingly Ent-like, while some Ents have become increasingly tree-like. The statement is easy to overlook, but it carries enormous implications. The boundary between Ent and tree is not entirely fixed. Over long ages, change can occur in either direction. A tree may become more aware. An Ent may become more rooted, more silent, more still. The Huorns appear to exist somewhere within that uncertain territory. They are not ordinary trees. They can move, they can gather, they can travel considerable distances during darkness. Yet they are not presented as true Ents either. Treebeard speaks of them almost as distant relatives whose nature has become difficult to define. The uncertainty feels intentional. Tolkien often leaves certain aspects of his world unexplained, not because he lacked answers, but because mystery itself gives depth to the landscape. There is an older quality to the Huorns than simple danger. When Merry later tries to describe them, he struggles. Their presence inspires unease rather than straightforward fear. They feel ancient. They seem aware of intruders. The forest around them ceases to resemble a collection of plants and begins to feel like a watching intelligence. Fangorn Forest becomes less a location and more a living community whose members do not all think in human ways. Why did the Ents themselves begin to diminish? The answer cannot be reduced solely to the loss of the Entwives, though that wound lies at the center of the story. Throughout the Third Age, Middle-earth increasingly becomes a world shaped by men. This transition appears throughout Tolkien's writings. The Elder Days belonged largely to elves and powers connected to the ancient world. By the end of The Lord of the Rings, the Fourth Age is often called the Dominion of Men. The Ents, like the elves, belong to an older order. The change unfolds gradually. Arnor rises in the north, and later fragments into Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar. Gondor expands into a mighty southern kingdom. Trade routes spread across western Middle-earth. Roads connect distant regions. Population grows. Forests retreat before settlement. None of these developments are inherently evil. Many represent civilization, stability, and prosperity. Yet from the perspective of the Ents, each expansion means less wilderness. Treebeard's memories reveal the scale of the transformation. He remembers forests that stretched across enormous territories. During the Third Age, those forests exist only as fragments. Fangorn survives. The old forest remains near the borders of the Shire. Mirkwood endures in the north, though under long corruption from the shadow of Dol Guldur. These are remnants. The continuous woodlands of earlier ages have been broken apart by centuries of change. One begins to understand why Treebeard often sounds melancholy. He is not simply mourning the Entwives. He is witnessing the gradual disappearance of the world he was created to protect. The trees still stand, but fewer of them. The forests still exist, but in reduced form. Memory becomes increasingly precious because so much of what it contains has vanished. Why is Treebeard called the oldest living thing that still walks beneath the sun? The statement comes from Gandalf himself. After his return as Gandalf the White, he speaks of Treebeard with immense respect. He calls him the oldest living thing that still walks beneath the sun upon Middle-earth. The wording deserves careful attention. Gandalf does not merely say Treebeard is old. He places him among the most ancient surviving beings in the world. By the War of the Ring in Third Age 3019, countless figures from earlier ages have departed. Gil-galad fell during the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age. Elendil died beside him. Celebrimbor perished centuries earlier during Sauron's wars. Even among the Eldar, many of the oldest individuals have sailed west to Aman. Galadriel, Elrond, and Círdan remain, but the ranks of the truly ancient grow thin. Treebeard belongs to an even older layer of history. His memories reach back toward the First Age, and perhaps beyond. He remembers landscapes that no longer exist. He recalls friendships whose participants have long departed from Middle-earth. Unlike historians who study records, Treebeard remembers directly. The past survives inside him. When he speaks of vanished forests, he does not describe legends. He describes places where he once walked. This perspective shapes his entire personality. Treebeard rarely rushes because he has seen what rushing accomplishes. Kingdoms hurry into wars. Rulers hurry into ambitious plans. Generations hurry through lives that seem brief from an Ents perspective. The trees teach a different rhythm. Seasons matter. Centuries matter. The slow accumulation of change matters. Treebeard embodies that philosophy more completely than perhaps any other character in Tolkien's world. Why did Saruman become the greatest threat Fangorn had faced in centuries? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Saruman turns toward evil. He allies himself with orcs. He seeks power. Yet the deeper reason connects directly to Yavanna's ancient fears. Saruman possesses many gifts inherited from his origin as a Maya. He is wise. He is skilled in craft. He possesses vast knowledge. These qualities should have made him a protector. Instead, they become tools of domination. Saruman originally arrived in Middle-earth around Third Age 1000 as one of the Istari, the wizards sent by the Valar to oppose Sauron. Alongside Gandalf, Radagast, and the Blue Wizards, he was intended to guide rather than rule. For centuries he fulfilled this mission. Eventually, he settled in Isengard, the great fortress at the southern end of the Misty Mountains. Gondor entrusted him with its guardianship. What began as stewardship slowly transformed into possession. The location of Isengard placed Saruman directly beside Fangorn Forest. Over time, he began cutting increasing quantities of timber. Furnaces appeared. Workshops expanded. Trees disappeared. The process accelerated dramatically during the years leading up to the War of the Ring. Saruman's armies required fuel and materials. His ambitions demanded constant production. Fangorn stood beside an industrial power that viewed forests primarily as resources. Treebeard notices all of this. The Ents notice it as well. Yet true to their nature, they do not immediately react. They observe, they think, they discuss. Years pass while concern gradually grows. The danger is real, but the Ents remain reluctant to abandon their traditional patience. That reluctance would soon be tested. For events already unfolding elsewhere in Middle-earth were moving toward Fangorn. Two small hobbits, fleeing captivity after the breaking of the Fellowship, were about to wander into the ancient forest and awaken forces that had remained quiet for far too long. Why did it take two hobbits to awaken the Ents when centuries of destruction had failed? The answer lies at the heart of Treebeard's character. The Ents were never indifferent. They saw the trees falling. They knew Saruman's furnaces consumed wood from the lands around Isengard. They understood that orcs crossed areas once left undisturbed. Yet understanding a problem and deciding to act upon it are not the same thing. Ents think in long spans of time. What appears urgent to men can seem momentary to a creature who remembers the First Age. The danger posed by Saruman was real, but for many Ents, it remained one more change in a world already full of changes. Everything shifted after the breaking of the Fellowship. At Amon Hen beside the river Anduin, the company fractured under pressure from Sauron's growing power. Boromir fell defending Merry and Pippin. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli began their pursuit of the captured hobbits. Merry Brandybuck and Peregrine Took were carried westward by orcs serving Saruman. Then events took an unexpected turn. Near the eaves of Fangorn Forest, the Rohirrim under Éomer destroyed the orc band, and the two hobbits escaped into the ancient woods. There, amid enormous trees and deep shadows, they encountered Treebeard. The meeting is one of the most remarkable in The Lord of the Rings. Two of the smallest free peoples in Middle-earth came face to face with one of its oldest inhabitants. Treebeard immediately sensed that the hobbits were neither orcs nor ordinary men. Their conversation unfolded slowly, exactly as one would expect from an Ent. Names were exchanged, histories were considered, questions wandered through distant memories before arriving at practical matters. Yet beneath the calm surface, Merry and Pippin carried something Treebeard needed: information. The hobbits had seen Saruman's actions directly. They had witnessed the growth of his military power. They knew about the Uruk-hai, the special breed of orcs serving Isengard. They described forests being destroyed to feed furnaces and support war. The threat ceased to be an abstract concern. Through the eyes of the hobbits, Treebeard saw the full scale of what was happening. One senses a subtle shift during these conversations. Treebeard remains patient, but his patience begins to harden into resolve. The stories told by Merry and Pippin fit patterns he had observed for years. Isolated incidents suddenly form a larger picture. Saruman is no longer merely an unwise neighbor. He has become a force actively opposing the purpose for which the Ents were created. The old promise given to Yavanna thousands of years earlier begins to stir. Why was the Entmoot one of the longest councils in Middle-earth? The answer becomes clear the moment one understands Entish nature. Treebeard decides that the matter cannot be settled by a single Ent, however ancient. A gathering must be called. Messengers travel through Fangorn Forest. Ents emerge from distant corners of the woods. They converge upon a place called Durndingle, a natural amphitheater deep within the forest. There, in March of Third Age 3019, one of the oldest assemblies in Middle-earth begins. The Entmoot lasts for 3 days, according to ordinary reckoning. For men, such a duration would seem lengthy but manageable. For Ents, however, The meeting is astonishingly swift. Treebeard himself comments on this. Entish conversations normally unfold at a pace that appears glacial to outsiders. Every statement receives careful consideration. Every implication is examined. Nothing is rushed. To an Ent, haste risks misunderstanding reality itself. Merry and Pippin observe the gathering from a distance. They hear voices rolling through the forest like distant thunder. The sound rises and falls. Names are spoken. Histories are recalled. Ancient grievances and responsibilities are weighed. Tolkien never records the full debate, but the atmosphere is unmistakable. This is not merely a council deciding military policy. It is an ancient people deciding whether to alter centuries of restraint. The Ents who attend are individuals, not a unified bloc. Some appear more cautious than others. Some remember different experiences. Some fear the consequences of intervention. Such diversity reflects Tolkien's broader approach to peoples and cultures. No race in Middle-earth functions as a hive mind. Elves disagree with one another. Dwarves disagree. Men certainly disagree. The Ents are no exception. The decision to go to war requires persuasion. Why did the Ents ultimately choose action over patience? The answer lies in the conclusion they reach. Treebeard later summarizes it in memorable words. The Ents decide that they are not going to war. They realize that they already are at war. The distinction matters. War has effectively been declared against them through the destruction of forests and the aggression of Saruman. Refusing to act no longer preserves peace. It merely accepts defeat. This realization transforms everything. For centuries, the Ents have responded to change with endurance. Endurance remains a virtue, but virtues can become weaknesses when circumstances alter. Saruman's ambitions threaten not merely individual trees, but entire forests. His industrial expansion represents exactly the danger Yavanna feared when she spoke to Manwë during the Years of the Trees. The tree shepherds finally recognize that their purpose requires intervention. The decision carries symbolic weight within Tolkien's mythology. Again and again, characters must determine when patience ceases to be wisdom. Gandalf faces such choices. Aragorn faces them. Even Frodo faces them. The Ents confront their own version of the dilemma. Preservation sometimes demands action. Guardianship sometimes demands strength. Ancient tranquility must occasionally give way to righteous anger. When the Entmoot ends, something extraordinary occurs. The forest begins to move. Ents emerge from every direction. Great figures stride beneath the branches. Their numbers remain unclear because Tolkien never provides a precise count. What matters is the impression. Creatures who have spent centuries tending forests now march together with a shared purpose. The age of contemplation has ended. Why was Saruman so unprepared for what followed? Part of the answer lies in arrogance. Saruman understood many things. He studied rings of power. He investigated ancient lore. He possessed immense knowledge concerning Sauron and the wider history of Middle-earth. Yet he underestimated the forces he considered primitive. Like many ambitious rulers throughout Tolkien's legendarium, he focused upon visible centers of power. Kings mattered. Armies mattered. Fortresses mattered. The Ents seemed irrelevant. This miscalculation mirrors an error made repeatedly by villains in Tolkien's world. Morgoth underestimated the resilience of the Free Peoples. Sauron underestimated hobbits. Saruman underestimated forests. He viewed trees as resources. He viewed Fangorn as a source of timber. He failed to grasp that the forest contained a will capable of answering destruction with resistance. His knowledge remained vast, but it lacked humility. Meanwhile, the Ents advanced southward from Fangorn toward Isengard. The distance was not great. The fortress stood at the southern edge of the forest, near the Gap of Rohan. Within Isengard rose Orthanc, the great black tower built by the Númenóreans during the early centuries of Gondor. The stone of Orthanc was nearly indestructible. Saruman trusted its strength. He trusted walls, gates, and engines of war. As the march continued, twilight settled across the land. Wind moved through the trees. Ents strode beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere ahead, furnaces still burned within Isengard. Orcs labored. Weapons were forged. Saruman remained occupied with his larger designs, unaware that one of the oldest peoples in Middle-earth was approaching his gates. By the next stage of the story, the Tree Shepherds would cease being observers of history and become one of its most decisive forces. Why was the fall of Isengard one of the most unexpected victories in the entire War of the Ring? If someone had surveyed Middle-earth shortly before the event, the outcome would have seemed impossible. Saruman possessed a fortress built by the Númenóreans. He commanded thousands of orcs and men. His armies had already marched against Rohan. Orthanc itself stood at the center of Isengard, a tower fashioned from black stone so hard that even Entish strength could not break it. The Ents, by contrast, had no weapons, no armor, and no formal military tradition. Yet within a matter of days, one of the most formidable strongholds in western Middle-earth would be reduced to ruin. The attack began on the night of March 2nd, 3rd Age 3019. According to the chronology preserved in The Lord of the Rings, the Ents descended upon Isengard from Fangorn Forest. Saruman's attention remained focused elsewhere. His armies were already moving against King Theoden of Rohan. The wizard had spent years calculating political alliances, military campaigns, and the ambitions of rival powers. He had not seriously prepared for an assault by living trees. The initial attack was devastating. Ents possess enormous physical strength. Treebeard describes them as capable of tearing stone apart and breaking iron as if it were brittle wood. The outer defenses of Isengard proved vulnerable to this kind of force. Walls cracked, gates collapsed. Defenders scattered dot-orcs who had spent their lives intimidating weaker opponents suddenly confronted enemies against whom conventional weapons offered little advantage. The balance of power shifted with shocking speed. Tolkien's description emphasizes movement and sound. Great figures stride through darkness. Stone breaks, water roars, trees advance where armies normally march. The imagery feels almost mythic, as though an ancient promise embedded within the world itself has awakened. Yavanna's Tree Shepherds are no longer watching history. They are shaping it. Why could the Ents destroy Isengard, but not Orthanc? The answer lies in the extraordinary origins of the tower. Orthanc had been constructed by the Númenóreans during the great centuries of Gondor's strength. Its builders inherited knowledge ultimately connected to Númenor, the island kingdom established after the downfall of Morgoth at the end of the First Age. Númenórean craftsmanship often bordered on the miraculous. Their harbors, fortresses, and towers surpassed the abilities of later generations. Orthanc represented one of their greatest achievements. The tower consisted of an almost indestructible black stone, whose exact nature Tolkien never fully explains. Neither fire nor ordinary tools could damage it. Even the Ents, capable of shattering walls and crushing gates, failed to break its structure. Treebeard himself later remarks that they could do little against Orthanc directly. Saruman had chosen his residence wisely. Yet the inability to destroy the tower did not save Isengard. The Ents recognized that victory required more than brute force. They adapted. Instead of attacking Orthanc itself, they focused upon everything around it. Workshops were demolished. Furnaces were smashed. Defenses disappeared. The great ring surrounding the tower became a wasteland of broken stone and flooded ground. Saruman retained his prison, but he lost his kingdom. This moment reveals a trait sometimes overlooked in discussions of the Ents. They are not mindless engines of destruction. Their strength is accompanied by practical intelligence. Treebeard and his companions understand terrain, water, and engineering. They identify weaknesses. They exploit opportunities. Their victory results not merely from power, but from judgment. Why did water become the Ents' greatest weapon? Once Isengard's outer works had been shattered, Treebeard turned to a force older than any fortress: water. The Ents broke dams, redirected flows, and opened channels that had long been constrained. Streams descending from the misty mountains poured toward Isengard. The river Isen contributed to the flood. Water surged through areas previously occupied by furnaces and workshops. The symbolism is difficult to miss. Saruman's industrial system depended upon fire. Trees were burned as fuel. Forests became smoke. The Ents answered with water. Flames hissed and vanished. Machinery ceased functioning. Places devoted to production became submerged beneath rushing currents. Tolkien does not present the scene merely as a military victory. It feels like a reversal of environmental devastation. Treebeard later describes the satisfaction the Ents experienced while watching the water spread through Isengard. Yet the tone remains measured rather than triumphant. The Ents do not delight in cruelty. They delight in restoration. Saruman's works are destroyed because those works represented ongoing harm. The flooding serves justice rather than vengeance. That distinction remains important throughout Tolkien's moral universe. By dawn, Isengard no longer resembled the fortress Saruman had ruled. Pools filled former courtyards. Debris floated across flooded ground. The proud industrial center became a shattered enclosure surrounding a solitary tower. Orthanc still stood, but its master found himself isolated. The wizard who had hoped to dominate nations now gazed out from a prison of his own making. Why did the Huorns leave Fangorn and march toward Helm's Deep? While the Ents attacked Isengard, another mystery unfolded elsewhere. King Theoden had withdrawn with the people of Rohan toward the Hornburg at Helm's Deep. There, during the night of March 3rd, 4th, Third Age 3019, a desperate battle took place against Saruman's invading army. Thousands of orcs and Dunlendings assaulted the fortress. The defenders fought under increasingly difficult conditions. Victory seemed uncertain. Then the Huorns appeared. Tolkien's account remains deliberately mysterious. Great masses of dark trees moved from Fangorn Forest. They advanced toward Helm's Deep during the night. Their arrival coincided with the final stages of the battle. When dawn came and Theoden's forces counterattacked alongside Gandalf and Erkenbrand, Saruman's army broke. Many surviving orcs fled toward the nearby woods formed by the Huorns. None returned. The text never provides a detailed description of what happened inside that forest. Witnesses report strange sounds. Fear spreads among the fleeing orcs. Afterward, the bodies of enemies are notably absent. The implication is clear enough to be unsettling. The Huorns dealt with the survivors. Tolkien leaves the details hidden behind shadows and rustling leaves, allowing the imagination to fill the silence. This episode highlights an important distinction. The Ents represent deliberate action. They debate, reason, and choose. The Huorns seem governed by older and darker impulses. They remain allied with the Ents, yet they evoke a different aspect of nature. Not every force within the natural world is gentle. Not every forest welcomes intruders. Why does Tolkien keep the Huorns mysterious instead of explaining them fully? The answer connects to a larger pattern visible throughout his legendarium. Certain mysteries remain unresolved because resolution would diminish them. The exact nature of Tom Bombadil is never revealed. The origins of the nameless things beneath Moria remain obscure. The ultimate fate of the Entwives remains uncertain. The Huorns belong within this category. Their ambiguity creates depth. Treebeard himself does not fully explain them. That omission feels significant. If even the oldest Ent cannot provide complete clarity, then the mystery belongs to the world rather than to the limits of human knowledge. Middle-earth contains realities older and stranger than the categories available to its inhabitants. The horns remind listeners that the forests of Arda possess secrets beyond simple classification. As the War of the Ring continued, news of Isengard's destruction spread across Rohan and Gondor. Saruman's power had been broken. The Ents had achieved a victory few believed possible. Yet their greatest triumph carried a bittersweet undertone. The forests had been defended. The furnaces had been extinguished. Still, the deeper wound remained unhealed. Even as Treebeard watched the waters surrounding Orthanc, somewhere in the back of his ancient mind lingered the same question that had haunted him for thousands of years. The Entwives were still missing, and the long search was not over. Did the Ents truly win, or was the fall of Isengard only a brief victory against a much larger fating? The question becomes unavoidable once the excitement of battle passes. The destruction of Isengard was real. Saruman's military power collapsed. The forests around Fangorn gained relief from immediate danger, yet Tolkien rarely presents history as a sequence of permanent triumphs. Victories matter, but they do not erase every loss that came before them. When the waters settled around Orthanc and the smoke disappeared from Saruman's furnaces, the Ents remained what they had been before the battle, an aging people living in a changing world. Treebeard, quote, conversations after the war carry this tone. He expresses satisfaction at Saruman's defeat, but not the exuberance of a people entering a new golden age. The Ents have prevented further destruction. They have not reversed centuries of decline. The Entwives remain absent. Ancient forests remain lost. The great wildernesses remembered from earlier ages have not returned. The victory protects what survives rather than restoring what has vanished. This pattern appears throughout The Lord of the Rings. The ring is destroyed, yet the elves still depart. Aragorn becomes king, yet mortality remains unchanged. Evil is defeated, but history continues moving forward. Tolkien's world does not promise the recovery of every lost thing. Some wounds heal. Others remain part of the shape of the world. The story of the Ents belongs firmly within that second category. Nevertheless, the victory matters profoundly. Without the Ents, Saruman's power might have continued growing unchecked. Rohan would have faced an even greater threat. Gondor would have confronted additional enemies during the War of the Ring. The Ents altered the course of events at a critical moment. Their intervention demonstrates that even ancient and diminished peoples can still influence history when the need becomes great enough. What became of Fangorn Forest after the War of the Ring? The answer emerges during the early years of the Fourth Age, after Sauron's defeat and Aragorn's coronation as King Elisar. The political map of Western Middle-earth changes significantly. The reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor enters a period of renewal. Alliances strengthen. Borders stabilize. For the first time in generations, many regions experience peace rather than constant warfare. Within this new order, Fangorn receives unusual protection. Aragorn recognizes the importance of the forest and the beings dwelling within it. The lands surrounding Isengard are reorganized. Orthanc remains standing, but Saruman is gone. The immediate threat posed by industrial expansion disappears. Fangorn gains room to breathe. Treebeard himself later oversees the growth of woodland into areas that had previously been damaged. The image feels deeply appropriate. For thousands of years, the Ents fought a defensive struggle, watching forests shrink and disappear. After the War of the Ring, the movement briefly reverses. Trees spread into abandoned spaces. New growth appears where destruction once dominated. It is not a return to the vast primeval forests of earlier ages, but it is renewal nonetheless. The old guardians witness life reclaiming ground that seemed lost. This development also reflects Aragorn's character. Unlike Saruman, he understands stewardship. Throughout Tolkien's writings, good rulers preserve rather than exploit. Aragorn's reign is remembered as wise, partly because he recognizes the value of things beyond immediate political gain. Fangorn matters not because it produces resources, but because it possesses its own place within the order of Middle-earth. Why does Treebeard remain hopeful after everything he has lost? The answer reveals one of the most admirable aspects of his character. Treebeard remembers the destruction of Beleriand. He remembers the disappearance of the Entwives. He remembers forests that no longer exist, yet he never becomes bitter. Sadness fills many of his memories, but bitterness does not. The distinction is important. Tolkien repeatedly portrays hope as a virtue maintained despite evidence of loss. One sees this quality when Treebeard speaks of the Entwives. Thousands of years have passed since their disappearance. Entire ages have rolled by. Logic alone would suggest abandoning the search. Yet Treebeard refuses to surrender completely. The possibility remains alive in him. Small though it may be, hope survives. That hope connects him to many other figures in Tolkien's mythology, who endure without certainty of success. Consider Aragorn wandering as a ranger before reclaiming his throne. Consider Gandalf resisting Sauron despite overwhelming odds. Consider Sam carrying Frodo through Mordor when victory appears impossible. Hope in Tolkien's world rarely depends upon favorable circumstances. Instead, it persists because abandoning it would mean surrendering something essential. Treebeard embodies this principle in a quieter form. His patience also plays a role. Mortals experience time as scarcity. Ents experience it as abundance. Thousands of years feel immense even to Treebeard, but not in the same way centuries feel to men. The future remains open. Possibilities remain. The world still contains unexplored corners. As long as uncertainty survives, hope retains a place to live. Could the Entwives still exist somewhere in Middle-earth? This question has fascinated readers for decades, and Tolkien himself encouraged the mystery rather than resolving it. One intriguing clue appears during Sam Gamgee's conversation with Treebeard. Sam recalls hearing stories from his cousin Halfast, who claimed to have seen tree-like figures moving beyond the north moors of the Shire. The report sounds remarkably similar to descriptions of Entwives. Treebeard immediately becomes interested. The possibility captures his attention because it points westward rather than eastward. If true, the sighting would suggest that at least some Entwives traveled far from the Brownlands. Yet Tolkien carefully avoids confirmation. The account remains secondhand. No evidence follows. The story hangs suspended between rumor and revelation. Many readers interpret this moment as deliberate encouragement. Tolkien could have omitted the anecdote entirely. Instead, he places it directly within a conversation about the Entwives. The effect is subtle but unmistakable. A door remains open. Not wide, not certain, merely open enough that hope remains reasonable. Treebeard himself chooses to leave it that way. Outside the published works, Tolkien addressed the subject in letters, yet even there, he never delivered a definitive conclusion. He acknowledged the possibility of survival without confirming it. Following the source hierarchy of the legendarium, the published text remains our highest authority, and the published text leaves the question unanswered. The mystery, therefore, belongs not to fan speculation alone, but to the structure of the story itself. Why did Tolkien leave the fate of the Entwives unresolved when he answered so many other questions? Part of the answer lies in realism. Real history contains unanswered questions. Civilizations disappear. Records vanish. Individuals are lost to time. Not every story reaches a tidy conclusion. Tolkien understood this deeply. As a scholar of ancient literature, he spent years studying fragments, incomplete narratives, and mysteries that could never be solved with certainty. Yet there is also a thematic reason. The Entwives embody longing. Their absence transforms the Ents from merely impressive creatures into tragic ones. If the Entwives returned, the emotional landscape of the story would change completely. The loss would become temporary. By leaving the question unresolved, Tolkien preserves the bittersweet quality that defines the Ents throughout The Lord of the Rings. Treebeard's search therefore becomes more than a literal quest. It becomes a symbol of memory itself. The Ents continue carrying knowledge of something precious, even after it seems irretrievable. They refuse to forget. They refuse to stop caring. In a world where many ancient things fade, that refusal possesses quiet dignity. As the Fourth Age begins, and the great events of the War of the Ring recede into history, Treebeard remains in Fangorn. The forest grows around him. Seasons pass. Leaves emerge and fall. Somewhere beyond known lands, the mystery of the Entwives remains unsolved. And as the years lengthen into decades and decades into centuries, the oldest living thing beneath the sun continues listening for news that never quite arrives, yet never entirely ceases to be possible. Were the Ents really a race of giant walking trees, or were they something much more important within Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth? By the end of their history, it becomes clear that the Ents occupy a unique place within the legendarium. They are not warriors in the manner of the Rohirrim. They are not craftsmen like the dwarves of Erebor or Khazad-dûm. They are not rulers, sailors, or wizards. Their origin reaches back to a promise spoken between Yavanna and Manwë before the awakening of the children of Ilúvatar. The Ents exist because someone had to speak for the forests. They embody a responsibility written into the world from its earliest days. That role explains why their story stretches across so many ages without centering upon conventional power. They witness the years of the trees only through their origins. They live through the First Age and remember lands lost beneath the sea. They endure the rise and fall of Númenor during the Second Age. They survive the Last Alliance, the decline of Gondor, the coming of the wizards, and the War of the Ring. Through all these transformations, their essential purpose remains unchanged. The forests need guardians, and the guardians remain at their posts. This continuity makes the Ents unusual even among Tolkien's ancient peoples. Elves change, kingdoms change, languages evolve. The Ents remain remarkably faithful to what they were created to do. There is wisdom in that constancy, though there is sadness as well. A people devoted to memory inevitably accumulates grief. Every vanished forest becomes part of their story. Every lost companion remains present in recollection. Their strength and sorrow grow from the same root. One can see this clearly in Treebeard. He carries the weight of ages, yet he never abandons his purpose. He still watches over Fangorn. He still knows the names of trees. He still remembers the Entwives. His immense age has not erased affection, curiosity, or hope. That persistence gives the character much of his quiet greatness. Why do the Ents feel older than almost anything else in Middle-earth? Part of the answer lies in how they experience time. Most peoples in Tolkien's world divide history into generations. Fathers give way to sons. Kingdoms rise and fall over centuries. The Ents stand outside that rhythm. Treebeard does not know history through inheritance. He knows it through direct memory. Events that require books for men require recollection for him. This difference affects everything about his speech and behavior. When Treebeard pauses before answering a question, he is not merely being slow. He is searching through an immense storehouse of lived experience. The destruction of Beleriand, the wandering of the Ents, the long search for the Entwives, the changing borders of forests and kingdoms, these are not academic subjects. They are memories. Tolkien gives very few characters such depth of temporal perspective. Galadriel comes close. Elrond comes close. Círdan the shipwright comes close. Yet even among these ancient figures, Treebeard feels distinct because his concerns remain tied to the landscape itself. Elves remember rulers, wars, and migrations. Treebeard remembers hills, rivers, and woods. His memory is geographical. He measures loss in vanished forests and altered horizons. This perspective allows Tolkien to show history from an angle rarely explored elsewhere in fantasy. Most stories focus on those who make events happen. The Ents often observe events happening around them. Their experience reminds the listener that history affects not only kings and heroes, but also the world through which those heroes move. Why did Tolkien make the Ents victorious at Isengard when so many ancient peoples are fading? The answer touches something central within the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's world is not a story of inevitable decline alone. If it were, the destruction of the ring would accomplish little. Hope would become meaningless. Instead, Tolkien balances loss with renewal. Ancient things fade, but their actions still matter. Old wisdom remains capable of shaping the future. The Ents demonstrate this beautifully. They are diminished. They are lonely. They are no longer numerous. Yet when the critical moment arrives, they change the course of the war. Their age does not make them irrelevant. Their apparent weakness conceals tremendous strength. Saruman dismisses them because he measures value according to power, production, and control. The Ents prove that he misunderstands the world he seeks to dominate. The same lesson appears elsewhere. Hobbits save Middle-earth while armies struggle. Mercy succeeds where force fails. Loyalty triumphs over ambition. Tolkien repeatedly overturns assumptions about what matters most. The Ents fit naturally into this pattern. They look like relics. In reality, they become decisive. Their victory also fulfills Yavanna's ancient concern. Long before Sauron rose, long before Saruman betrayed his mission, Yavanna feared what unchecked exploitation might do to living things. The Ents become her answer. They are not invincible. They do not prevent every harm. But when destruction grows too great, they respond. The promise made beneath the light of the two trees proves true. Why does the story of the Ents continue to resonate long after the final page? Partly because their concerns feel timeless. The tension between growth and preservation appears throughout human history. Forests become farms. Wilderness becomes settlement. New creations require resources from the natural world. Tolkien understood that these realities cannot be avoided entirely. The Ents do not oppose all change. The Entwives themselves embraced cultivation and agriculture. The deeper question concerns balance. Treebeard never condemns every act of cutting wood. He understands necessity. What alarms him is thoughtless destruction. Saruman takes without respect. He consumes without gratitude. The contrast between stewardship and exploitation runs throughout the Ents' history. It remains just as relevant to readers as it was when Tolkien wrote the story. Yet the appeal of the Ents goes beyond environmental themes. They also represent memory. In a fast-moving world, they remind us of older rhythms. They pause before speaking. They listen before acting. They value continuity. Such qualities can appear almost alien in the modern age, which is precisely why they feel powerful. The Ents embody a way of experiencing existence that resists haste. There is also something deeply moving about their refusal to forget. The search for the Entwives continues despite overwhelming odds. Treebeard's hope survives despite centuries of disappointment. The longing remains painful, but abandoning it would mean abandoning love itself. Tolkien understood that some losses become part of who we are. The Ents carry theirs with dignity, and so the long history of the tree shepherds comes at last to its quiet resting place. The wars have passed. The ring is gone. The kingdoms of men enter a new age. Somewhere in Fangorn Forest, leaves whisper high above the forest floor. Treebeard walks beneath branches older than many realms, pausing now and then to listen. The waters around Isengard have long since settled. The shadows of ancient battles have faded. Yet in the deep twilight of the woods, where roots grip the earth and stars shine through distant leaves, the oldest guardian of the forests still waits, still remembers, and still listens for footsteps that might one day belong to the lost Entwives. If you listen closely to the history of the Ents, you begin to notice that their story is not really about trees alone. It is about stewardship. Again and again throughout Tolkien's world, the greatest disasters emerge when power forgets its proper purpose. Morgoth seeks possession rather than harmony. Sauron seeks domination rather than order. Saruman abandons wisdom for control and begins to see forests, rivers, and living creatures as materials to be consumed. Against them stand figures who understand that the world is not something to own. The Ents never desire kingdoms. They never seek crowns. Their strength comes from serving something beyond themselves, and in Tolkien's vision, that is often where true strength is found. There is also a deeper sadness running beneath their tale, one that connects them to many of the oldest peoples of Middle-earth. The elves watch their brightest realms fade. The Dunedain remember the lost glory of Númenor. The Ents search endlessly for the Entwives. None of them can recover everything they have lost. Tolkien does not pretend otherwise. The world moves forward, and even the noblest victories cannot restore every forest, every friendship, every vanished age. Yet the refusal to surrender memory becomes a kind of victory of its own. The Ents continue remembering because what was loved remains worthy of remembrance. Perhaps that is why Treebeard feels so ancient and so familiar at the same time. His grief never hardens into bitterness. His losses never destroy his capacity for wonder. He can speak of vanished lands with sorrow, yet still delight in the sound of water running over stones. He can mourn the Entwives and still hope to find them. In Tolkien's world, hope is rarely loud. It does not arrive with trumpets or certainty. More often, it survives quietly, carried through centuries by those willing to keep faith with things they may never see restored. The Ents also reveal something important about time itself. Most of the peoples of Middle-earth live within history. The Ents live beside it. They remind you that kingdoms, battles, and famous heroes occupy only a small part of the world's life. Forests grow while dynasties rise and fall. Rivers continue flowing after armies have vanished. Stars shine above victories and defeats alike. Treebeard's perspective invites you to step outside the urgency of events and look instead at the longer rhythm beneath them, the rhythm of seasons, roots, and enduring things. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom hidden within their history. The world is preserved not only by warriors who win great battles, but by guardians who remain faithful to their purpose across long years. The Ents cannot stop every loss. They cannot prevent every axe from falling. Yet when the moment finally comes, when destruction threatens to overwhelm what remains, they rise. Slowly, deliberately, and without seeking glory, they rise. Their story suggests that endurance itself can be a form of courage. So, as the tale settles into silence, you return once more to that ancient forest. The night air is cool beneath towering branches. Far above, leaves stir softly against one another. A single leaf loosens from its stem and drifts downward through the twilight, turning slowly as it falls among roots older than kingdoms. Somewhere beyond sight, deep within the quiet woods, an old Ent pauses to listen, and the forest listens with him.